Welcome to Beat Diabetes. We're going to be looking at a book today, and we'll probably be looking at it for several weeks. This one is called Rethinking Diabetes by Gary Taubes. Most people involved with the keto movement and beating diabetes know about Gary. Gary Taubes is not a doctor. He's not a nutritionist. He is a journalist and a writer and a researcher. He has won awards from some kind of a society for science writers. So he's pretty well known, and he's published 6 books, and this, I believe, is his latest one, Rethinking Diabetes. So it's a thick book. It's actually thicker than it needs to be, strangely enough, because when I got to the end, it was like this then breaks off into the bibliography without even coming to a conclusion. I thought, that's very odd. Did they leave off some pages? And then I realized that the end was actually about 30 pages earlier, and then they just reprinted some pages from the middle, which obviously was a mistake. Shame on the publishers, but hopefully they've got that fixed by now. So if you get a copy, you may not have that problem, but not a big deal. I was hearing Gary being interviewed by, I believe, Dr. Hyman, and Gary said, well, I'm not a very good marketer because I published a book, I wrote a book that the people that need it the most are probably going to be the least likely to buy it and read it. And he's probably right about that. It is thick, even without the extra pages. And it goes into a lot of detail, a lot of the history of where we've come over the last several hundred years in connection with diabetes. It gets deeper than most people probably want it to get. Most people that are diabetic they're desperate to get their A1C down, their fasting glucose down, and to get rid of neuropathy and different diabetic complications. They're like, give me points A, B, C, and D, and tell me what to eat and what not to eat, what to do, what not to do. Just give me the facts, ma'am, just the facts. And Gary gets into the history and the depth of it, but that's his mind. He is a deep thinker, and he's got a mind to research. He's not just content to say, well, don't do this and do this instead. He does eventually give you that in this book, along with all his other books, but he has to do the research. It kind of reminds me of something that my dad used to say, he who knows how will always have a job, and he who knows why will always be the boss. So I guess when it comes to metabolic syndrome and beating diabetes, I'm kind of the how guy. I know how to beat it, at least in my own life, and that gives me a job, you might say. That gives me a calling and a ministry. Gary knows more the why of it, and goes into many details. I'm going to just start out with his introduction, just a few quotes, just to share a few thoughts. We'll get into it at a much deeper level later on. But let me just start out with his very first sentence in his introduction. You can't do better than that, right? Of all the chronic diseases that are likely to end our lives prematurely, says Gary, sentence number 1, none has been so intimately and surely linked to our diets as diabetes. Well, I agree. It's linked to diet. And that really is some very, very good news, because diet's something you can change. There's a lot about life you cannot change. And if you're born nerdy, you can buy a dozen books on how to be cool, but you'll never really be cool. I know, because I've never been very cool myself. If you're born ugly, you can comb your hair, and if you're a lady, put on eye makeup and so forth, and you can improve things a little bit, but you'll never be drop-dead gorgeous. So there are some things in life we cannot change. There are some diseases we can't do much about, but just hope we come out okay. And maybe take whatever meds the doctor prescribed us, or get whatever surgery the doctor says we need to have. So there's a lot in life you can't do a whole lot about, but if it's true, what Gary starts out by saying, nothing has been linked, no disease has been linked to diet more than diabetes. If that is true, it's tremendous hope for us all, because diet, I can do something about that. In fact, 2 meals per day, in my case, usually, or maybe in your case, 3 meals a day, you make decisions about what you're going to put into your mouth. What will I put in my mouth at lunch? I think I'll put in my mouth some chips and a hamburger. Or I think I'll put in my mouth a big helping of lasagna. Or I think I'll put a salad in my mouth. You make that decision. There's nobody forcing you. Nobody's telling you, you got to eat this, you got to eat that. It's strictly on your own. Unless you're a slave somewhere, and last I checked, slavery's been outlawed, so there's not supposed to be any legal slavery anymore. That means you're free to eat whatever you like, and that's good news. There's never been anybody force me. Now, when I was young, my mom would strongly encourage me to eat my vegetables, be like Popeye and eat your spinach. But I've been an adult for a long time now, and nobody forces me to eat anything I don't want to eat. So, good news. If it really is a dietary disease, if it really is linked to diet, all I've got to do is one thing: figure out what's the best diet for a diabetic, and then start eating that way, and I should see improvement. And lo and behold, that's exactly what happens. And if you don't believe that, watch some of our videos. Listen to and watch some of the interviews I do with diabetics that thoroughly whipped diabetes, and just read some of the comments under the videos. So there's a quote for you. Here's another one, and this kind of goes along with the first one. Gary writes, by the mid-19th century, when the disease was still so rare that even large urban hospitals of the era could go years without seeing a case. And then he goes on from there, but I just want to stop and just make that point. It's kind of staggering to think about it. Large city hospitals of those days, 1800s, 19th century would be the 1800s. He says large hospitals in big cities, they wouldn't even hardly see diabetes at all. They could go years without seeing a single case of diabetes. They knew what it was. It was in the textbooks, and they heard about it in medical school, but they just didn't see it much. And what they did see often was the type 1 version of it, not so much the type 2. Again, that's kind of encouraging, because if there was a time, a couple of 100 years ago, when there was almost no diabetes and now there's a lot of diabetes, what question should we be asking? What in the world are we doing that's giving us all this diabetes? And really, the question should be, what in the world are we eating that is giving us all this diabetes? And some people will just go all around the dietary issue. They'll say, well, we're not sleeping enough, and sleep can make a difference. I'm not saying it can't, but that's not the major issue. Some say, well, we're too sedentary, and that can make a difference, but that's not the major issue. You can sleep poorly, and you can be sedentary, and still pretty thoroughly whip diabetes if you give no fuel for the fire of diabetes to burn with. Diabetes is like a fire, and it depends on fuel. And if you give it no fuel, the fire goes out. And the fuel is excess carbohydrates. And we live in a world where we're just over-consuming and overdosing on carbohydrates of all kinds. The answer, of course, is to cut those carbohydrates way down. But I was kind of amazed when I read this and thought about it. It's not that I didn't know that there was less diabetes back in the old days. I knew that for sure. But he said there were large hospitals in big cities that they would go years without seeing a single case of diabetes. Wow, wow, wow. All right, well, let me just share one more thought here. I had a few other quotes, but we're running out of time. I'm trying to keep this on the short side. This I found fascinating. Still, we're in the introduction. But Gary writes this: in 1960, the average patient, I think he's quoting from somebody else, but he says the average patient with type 2 diabetes would be diagnosed at 65 years old. Well, people are being diagnosed a lot sooner than that. But he says the average would be 65. The average lifespan was 70. So that's really something to think about. Typical diabetic diagnosed at 65, he's dead by 70 because that's your average lifespan anyway. So basically, you've got 5 years to have to deal with real diabetes, not pre-diabetes, but real diabetes, according to American standards. Gary writes, now type 2 diabetes is often appearing in patients in their mid-40s. But thanks to many advances in drug therapy and technologies, they're likely to live into their 80s. So nowadays, they get diagnosed sooner, but they live longer, often into their 80s, which means they may go 30, 35, even as many as 40 years of their life, the last years, as a diabetic. Now, you may say, well, that's great. That's wonderful. You can be diagnosed at 45 and live to be 80 or 85. That's fantastic. The problem with that is often those are not good years for them. And I know that's true from looking at my mom's life. She was diagnosed, I think, in her mid to late 50s, but it really got severe at around 65. She lived to be 80, so she lived what many would consider to a good old age. But those last 15, 16 years, she was in and out of the hospital constantly with an angioplasty and bypass surgeries and strokes and heart attacks. She had blood pressure so high that she had to take 5 pills for her blood pressure. She was taking pills for diabetes, and she had one amputation, then she had the other leg cut off, and then it didn't heal right. They had to do a reamputation higher up. Her last 15 years were pretty miserable. Now, she was optimistic enough that she could still enjoy life when she wasn't going through all this, but it took a lot out of her. And my mom was a strong woman with a great sense of humor, a very happy person, but those last years were tough on her. And you could see at times that she wasn't the happy lady that she had been earlier. So the idea that we're going to get diagnosed with diabetes sooner, we'll become diabetic sooner, and I think that's true. There are people that surprise me. They're in their 30s and they're already diabetic. That didn't used to be the case. Some in their 40s, that still wasn't the case. Used to be you'd be in your 60s. Now it could be much sooner. But because of technology and the surgeries we can do and the medicines we can give and the various improvements in medical technology and so forth, you still may be able to live to be 80, 85. But who wants to live like that? How much better to live to be 85 or 80 or 90, and you're healthy almost up till your last month or two, which is how my dad passed away. I think it was around 5 or 6 months, but he died at 87, but he was healthy up to about 86 and a half. That's a whole lot better than going through year after year after year of miseries and getting a toe cut off and then another toe cut off and then the foot cut off and then you may end up on dialysis and doctors are looking at you and telling you you've got real problems and you kind of hang on. It reminds me of a marathon runner who's just limping along. About halfway through the race, he falls and hurts himself, but he's determined to finish, so he limps along. He can't run anymore, but he can limp. And he limps along the last half of the race. Well, we have to give him credit and admire his tenacity, his perseverance to finish the race. But how much better to finish the race running at a good pace. You're not limping, you're jogging, you're running, you're doing well. That should be our goal. So when we first learn, like many of you have learned, you're either diabetic or you're getting mighty close. It's time to make the dietary changes you need to make, along with exercise and along with trying to get better sleep and all the things you need to do. Make the changes, my friend. Make the changes and enjoy the last years of your life. Do you need more information and inspiration about beating diabetes? The very first line of our description is nearly always a link to our hundreds of videos toward that one subject, how to beat diabetes. Click on that link and start watching these videos. You'll be blessed and I believe greatly helped.